Today, you are joining us for our first of a series of building cultural responsiveness in mobile crisis teams. So today we are reviewing the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander population. And the next 4 trainings are going to be coming up, 1 per month, more or less, over the next few months. So please mark your calendars for these dates because we would love to have you in learning how to support different folks of all cultures, of all backgrounds, as we're going out and conducting mobile crisis services. So this is a great opportunity to learn more about different populations, to learn how we can support and help, to learn about some of the struggles that these populations experience, and maybe what their relationship is to mental health, mental wellness, and how to seek treatment in their group. So huge opportunity for us as mobile crisis responders to be able to really support and help our entire community being culturally aware and exhibiting cultural humility too. So I am Erin Zamora, and I am a technical and training assistant specialist with the Center for Applied Research Solutions. So I'm going to be heading up this series as a subject matter expert in mobile crisis teams. And with this series, it is part of the DHCS. It's sponsored by DHCS, administered by CARS, and underneath the M-TAC project, which is the Medi-Cal Mobile Crisis Training and Technical Assistance Center, in collaboration with Advocates for Human Potential. So being aware that the views shared by our subject matter experts today may not necessarily reflect the views or positions of DHCS, CARS, or AHP, or the M-TAC team. And with everything that we have in our presentation today, it is part of the public domain, so it can be reproduced and shared. However, please do not do so for a profit. Please don't share and sell this information. And if you're looking to sell it, then please get written permission ahead of time. And also just a disclaimer that any views or policies in the chat does not necessarily reflect those of DHCS or the presenters or M-TAC or AHP. So I think that's all of our disclaimers. So today I want to extend a very warm welcome. We are very excited to have Dr. Surya Bhattacharya as well as Dr. DJ Ida present with us through the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. So they're here to educate us on culturally responsive crisis care in the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. And I'll be jumping in every once in a while as the expert in mobile crisis services to support our teams out in the field on how we can help those of this population as it shows up. So, doctors, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My name is DJ Ida, and I'm the former executive director and the founding executive director of NAPIMA, the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. I am now in the process of retiring, but I think working with the community and working with Dr. Bhattacharya and others is something that is near and dear to my heart. And really appreciate all of you being here today, because as we're moving through with our presentation with others, it's an ongoing evolution of what we're doing. And so it's kind of hard to kind of let go. But thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Surya, who will introduce herself.
Thank you, DJ. Welcome, everyone. I see folks are introducing themselves in the chat. Thanks for doing that. Good to have you all here. I'm Dr. Surya Bhattacharya. I'm a psychologist, and currently I work as the diversity director of a graduate program at Columbia University's Medical School, as adjunct faculty at Naropa University in Colorado. I'm on the NAPIMA training team, and I think what's probably relevant for this group is I serve on the Suicide Prevention Resource Center's Lived Experience Advisory Committee, and I worked at, and early in my training, was a mobile crisis team responder in Alachua County in Gainesville, Florida. And so it's really great to be working with folks who are doing the work that you all do. It's so important.
So as we're looking at what we want to do today, we know that all of you have received crisis training So what we're going to do is we're going to add on to that. And let me see. Okay. So basically, what we're hoping to accomplish at the end of this is being able to define and understand principles of culturally responsive crisis care, being able to differentiate between cultural competence and cultural humility in mobile crisis. And the definitions has really sort of evolved over many, many decades about how we even look at culturally and linguistically responsive care. We want to increase their knowledge of culturally responsive communication and de-escalation techniques in the API community, better understand the role of behavioral health interpreters in crisis response, and better understand and apply the no wrong door approach in mobile crisis situations with people in the AANHPI community. That having been said, what we also want to acknowledge is there's great diversity within the AANHPI communities, and it's not possible for us to cover everything, and I think to do it justice. So our primary focus is going to be with the Asian American communities, but it's also, I think it's really important. We always advocate to make sure that there are those who are experts in the arena of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities to also be able to go into depth, so that I think you really learn from the experts who are from those communities to talk about that. But those are the general learning objectives that we have for, and then the last one is to expand the knowledge of culturally responsive communication in crisis situations. So those are sort of the overall learning objectives. And Sriya?
And so the way that we're going to touch on all these learning objectives is through what we have in store for you today. So the first thing we're going to do is start off with an honoring of Yang Yang and Victoria Lee, who will explain a little bit more in depth in a moment who those folks are, if you have yet to hear of them. Then we're going to be moving into an overview of the evolution of crisis response models and culturally responsive care, and talk a bit about specifically what it's like to work with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. You'll sometimes see an acronym through our presentation, AANHPI, and that's what it means. Then we'll be moving through mental health issues, challenges, and opportunities that impact these communities. And we'll talk a bit more about what we at NAPIMA call redefining a mental health approach to use a whole health, public health approach, which is what a lot of you all are positioned to do as mobile crisis responders. We're going to talk about using a strengths-based approach, and then key takeaways to providing culturally responsive care. So we want to first just start off by honoring the lives of Yang Yang and Victoria Lee. Each of these young people lost their lives while they were experiencing a mental health crisis, and each of them requested mental health help through 988. So on May 2nd, 2024, Yang Yang, who's pictured on the left, is a 40-year-old man living in Koreatown in Los Angeles, was shot and killed by police in less than 10 seconds after police opened the door to his parents' apartment after his parents called for mental health help in the middle of their son's bipolar episode. 4 months after Yang Yang's death, 25-year-old Victoria Lee, who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, was fatally shot by a police officer in Fort Lee, New Jersey. The family made repeated efforts to prevent an escalation of the situation and begged police officers not to enter the home as their presence was upsetting to her. These two young folks, Yang and Victoria, did not know each other. They lived on opposite ends of the country and were both diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Their families understood their mental health problems, but their requests for help were ignored, and the grief for the Yang and Lee families will last a lifetime. Our hope is that hearing these stories will help us become better equipped to work with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and hopefully prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. And with proper care, we can reduce the severity of crises to begin with. So hopefully we can all hold their memories in our hearts and minds throughout this presentation as the reason that we're doing this today. So just to start off, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, crisis response models have changed over time. The traditional crisis response model was actually probably the one that I was trained through, where crises were routed through a 911 center and then dispatched through local law enforcement agencies. So really, the police had the primary response system. But as we've built more awareness on the importance of addressing behavioral health, and we recognize that police can be an important partner if properly trained, this isn't their primary role. And so we've recognized that it's critical to expand how crisis services are administered, and that it's critical to raise awareness of mental health issues and bring in community-based providers who are familiar with the community and have the clinical expertise to assure the proper disposition is made. And so now behavioral models and the Medi-Cal mobile crisis model are what we are using, which is more emerging and innovative to minimize law enforcement use and emphasize more community-based response. And so our presentation today is going to be focused on how can we partner and best engage with the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. DJ, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. So historically, communities of color, ethnically diverse populations have always been receiving less quality of care. All the policy papers saying access to care is critical to reducing disparities, but for so many, they were saying they have very little to access. And so when the Office of Behavioral Health Minority Health put together the CLAS standards in 2000, it really was looking at developing standards to be able to say, these are the ways that we need to change the communities and change the way that things are done. It was really good about this, as you can see, that basically when we're looking at the primary standards, is to be able to provide effective, equitable, understandable, and respectful quality of care services that are responsive to the diverse cultural health beliefs and practices, preferred languages, health literacy, and other communication needs. And they broke it down into 3 general areas, which I'm going to go over very, very briefly. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the CLAS standards, but it really lays the foundation for crisis work, but also work in general. Because the more that we look at this and we look at it on an everyday basis, the hope is that we prevent the crisis from occurring. But clearly, in the event of a crisis, you really need to be aware of this. So the 3 general areas are governance and leadership and workforce, communication and language assistance, and engagement, which is continuous improvement and accountability. So there are 15 standards. And so if we go on to the next slide, basically the CLAS standards, again, are broken into these 3 areas. We're talking about governance. It's really, really important because you can have the best trained provider, the best crisis care worker, but if there aren't the overall structures to make sure that it stays in place and that it really puts forward, we're very, very limited in what we're able to do. So part of the workforce part of the governance is also workforce. NAPIMA has consistently been pushing for making sure that everybody is properly trained, whether it's somebody with a PhD, an MD, MSW, a peer specialist, whatever it happens to be. The workforce is absolutely critical for being able to make the changes. Because of the diversity within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, it is impossible for one provider to be able to provide services in all those different languages. So redefining who is defined as a provider becomes really, really critical. Communication and language assistance. It's impossible to say that one of the 3 areas is more important than the others, but communication language assistance is absolutely critical given the great diversity within the Asian communities. We've all seen when the wrong language was used or somebody didn't understand it, which is why one of the things NAPIMA did is to actually train interpreters to work in the mental health arena, and worked a lot of people in California. It's to making sure that these languages are understood in all formats. And again, we won't have time to go into depth today, but in a future slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the use of proper language, using interpreters, because using a poor interpreter, having an improperly trained provider can make the difference between getting through a crisis properly or escalating the situation. Engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability. We're looking at that. You may have things in place, but if there's no way to make sure that these services continue on and that people are held accountable, sometimes we're afraid of being held accountable part of it is for us to be willing to say what worked, what didn't work. And as we're continuing assessing what's appropriate, today's training is part of that. What are all of you doing? What are your strengths? What are the things that can be worked on? That's where we continue to make the changes that are going to be imperative for all of our communities. And things that we learn in one community can always be translated and transferred to other populations. So what NAPIMA has always done, we really try to avoid saying, when you see a Chinese, you do this, when you see a Vietnamese, you do that. It's being able to think conceptually on all through these areas. What are the kinds of things that we really need to do that will improve the quality of services? And there's specific things to our populations, but these are just general standards that really have guided the field since the year 2000. And we're going to continue to just sort of evolve into this area there. So we're looking at where this comes from. It's actually embedded in law. So the first one is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protects against discrimination of any individual based on national origin. Language falls under that category. So if anybody is receiving federal dollars, a person can actually say, by law, you must provide these services. When we get into the next slide about threshold languages, it's going to be impossible. The state of California has the highest percentage of Asian Americans in there. Being realistic, you're not going to be able to access all of them. But people do have a right under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The executive order, which came in year 2000. So you see a lot was happening in 2000. We had the development of the CLAS standards. The executive order requires public entities to create and maintain a language access plan that ensures meaningful access to programs. So what they're doing is we had Title VI in 2000. We want to make sure there's some teeth behind it. How are you going to do that? The Affordable Care Act was one of the most major pieces of legislation that looked at integrated care, which brought together behavioral health and physical health. But we wanted to make sure that in the in the Affordable Care Act, they also look at use of interpretation and translation. And then the American with Disabilities Act focuses primarily on language access, including those who are having hearing disabilities. So, and are visually impaired. So these are the kinds of things that really give what all of you are doing as crisis workers some real teeth to saying there are pieces of legislation in there that says people have a right to have language access. And for our communities, if you don't have it, it's just not going to happen. These are maybe some of you already know this, but we're looking at threshold languages. The mobile crisis teams really need to ensure that all team members are comfortable with the protocols for accessing interpreters and language lines. And then it's also looking at these are the top 12 non-English languages. So you can read, I'm not going to go through them, but these are the populations. And this is going to change from county to county. So the definition of the primary language is 3,000 members of the Medi-Cal eligibility data system, or 5% of the qualified population, whichever is lower. And that's how California determines how they're going to allocate resources for threshold languages. So anyway, I'm going to now pass it back over to Sriya.
Thank you, DJ. And yeah, as you can see on the slides, these are some of the top 12 non-English languages. And many of them are Asian-speaking languages: Chinese, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Korean, Farsi, Arabic, Japanese, Punjabi, Khmer. So many of the communities you might work with, this may be their first language.
Surya, if I could just add in, with those threshold languages, all 18 threshold languages that we have in the state of California, DHCS has approved safety plan tools. So for those of you who are utilizing that Medi-Cal bundled benefit, you have tools available in the appropriate language and appropriate modality for all of those 18 threshold languages for the consumers that you may be interacting with.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for adding that in, Erin. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what it's like to work with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. So broadly, These communities include hundreds of culture and tremendous diversity. It's not a monolith. Some of these communities have been in the United States for generations and generations. Some families were recruited to come to the US for perhaps work, specialized skills, or for farm labor. Many are refugees from many places like Southeast Asia and other communities, and are fleeing, persecution in their home countries. And a lot of these communities also have, internal challenges amongst themselves, based on, political histories in their countries of origin. And so when they're coming here, they're coming in here with their own unique challenges and unique strengths, from their histories. And so that's just important to keep in mind. As we talk about this, we are talking in generalities, but that there's a lot of diversity among these communities. Specifically in California, AANHPI residents comprise roughly of 15.5% of the population of 6 million people. And this population has grown by 25% in the past decade, which is faster than any other ethnic group. And the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population is relatively small, but it's also one of the fastest growing racial groups in the state. The largest Asian American ethnic group in California currently is Filipinos, and that's closely followed by Chinese and Vietnamese people. And since 2020, the Asian American population in California has increased by 10%. And so you can see just the importance of really focusing on learning how to work with these communities. And so more specifically, to drill down where these communities live. So there's a graphic here on the right of this slide where communities are broken down by color. So Chinese is red, Filipino green, Hmong yellow, Indian blue, and Vietnamese purple. And so these aren't all the communities, but these are some. And then you can see that, based on the color, there's different cities where it shows the height of those different populations and who's the majority in those populations. So you might just kind of want to think about, where do I work, and who are the communities that are the largest populations where I'm coming from. And then you can see on the right here the number totals for those communities from when this graph was made. And so just some highlights. Los Angeles County is home to more Asian Americans than any other county in the entire United States. San Diego, Sacramento, Alameda, and Orange counties also have very large populations of Asian Americans. Riverside and San Bernardino are also seeing rapid growth in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations. And Orange County has the third largest AAPI population in the US and the largest Vietnamese population. AANHPIs make up 26% of the population in Orange County. So maybe just, referencing, where do I work, and, who are the people that are from this community that might be around me. And so largely, many of the recent migrants in California are from Asia. And so Asian Americans currently represent 15% of the total's undocumented population as well. And I think maybe it goes without saying, these are issues that are important for us to really be, aware of, considering a lot of the national rhetoric around, immigration and undocumented communities, just to know, who's impacted by this, and how might the communities I work with be feeling impacted by this right now. Over half of immigrants arriving between 2013 and 2022 were born in Asia, so over the past decade. And it's estimated that almost 500,000 undocumented Asian migrants are in California. And so, why is this important? And so I think we need to think about a little bit of what DJ was talking about before. It's really important to increase language services. Bilingual providers are important, but we need to really engage those different threshold language services that Erin mentioned, and also working on training local community members to be able to help provide services as well. And this is something we think a lot about at NAPIMA as, we need to help train community members as paraprofessionals and integrate folks who are from the AAPI community into mobile crisis teams, so that, they can be familiar with maybe some of the cultural practices in their own communities. And that it's just important that we recognize, just some of the histories people are coming in with and have a trauma-informed approach and try to engage in culturally specific practices. And I know, Erin, you were going to chime in here too a little bit more about what might be specific to mobile crisis responders and thinking about the migrant population in California.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think all of us can appreciate that with so many folks being undocumented, that they would have a healthy distrust of calling into a government agency to receive help. So I think it's really important as we're triaging those calls, as we're heading out to work with people who may or may not be documented. We may not know what their legal status is, and it's none of our business what their legal status is. So it's important for them to know that we are not going to ask that information. We are not going to document that information, that our sole source in going out is to keep them safe, is to get them linked up with the care that they need. And so recognizing that there may be a fear, a distrust of having a government agency come out and just being aware of that. Going back to the trauma-informed care, being aware that they may not be open to discussing things with mobile crisis providers. And so just creating an atmosphere for them that is safe. And so if we have to verbalize that, I don't care what your legal status is, I'm here to help, then that's what we need to do in order to create that trust with them.
And just a second, I'll talk brief about the difference between a refugee and an immigrant, because those two statuses are very, very, present a very complex set of issues. But it's also being able to give permission. It's like, I understand this is really, really difficult. And what we're here to do is provide support for you, but to recognize that they have been traumatized. And because of either feel like they're not going to be understood, they're so afraid to approach mental health is going to look very, very different for these populations than the general population in the United States. So just even acknowledging that is going to be really important. Very briefly, if we're just sort of looking at, and so even though we weren't focusing on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders per se, I want to present just sort of a few of the statistics there. Suicide was a leading cause of death for Native Hawaiians ages 15 to 24, and that's also for the Asian American populations. Depressive disorders among the Native Hawaiian populations was 13.4% higher than the state average in Hawaii. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders fare worse than the white population across most health, mental health, and social determinants of health issues. And the high prevalence of mental health problems and underutilization of mental health treatment, it's more severe in these populations than the non-Hispanic white. And oftentimes people don't understand, but when we talk about the difference between a refugee and an immigrant, there's a third category that really needs to be looked at. And this is why we really encourage you to continue to get more information specifically from the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. And that is the status of having been colonized. I have Native American friends or Native Hawaiian friends who say, we did not immigrate to the United States. The United States landed on us. And to understand what those dynamics are, that really helps understanding what their situation is and what it's like for them to be in crisis, for them to be able to take the proper services for them. So basically, the other thing, whether it's with whatever the population is, whenever I've talked to somebody who had thought about suicide, many of them were just saying, whether it was Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or Asian American, first generation, fifth generation, whatever it happens to be, talking to them and said, just saying, I hear you saying that you really want to die. But sometimes people say, when they're talking about suicide, they don't want to die. They just want the pain to go away. And it's there. People go, it's like this little light bulb goes up in their head and they go, you're right. I don't want to die. I just want the pain to go away. And I don't know how. When you're in a crisis, this allows you to be able to say, we may not have all the answers, but you're not alone. I'm here to be with you. We understand this can be a really, really difficult situation. So when you're doing that, it's also really, really important. The other things that's really hard is there's a fear of maybe they've dealt with, and again, this would go for the next slide. They're also dealing with the challenges of meeting a system that's not responsive to their needs. Sometimes the system isn't responsive, not because they're cruel or don't care. It's just not having that information. So it's also being able to make sure you use the proper languages. There's mental health itself has a huge stigma in the general population. I remember working with somebody who was a father, came from Asia. He had a son who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. When the psychiatrist wanted him to take medication, the father did not want to do that. The physicians were saying, this father doesn't care what's going on. What we try to inform them is understanding what a diagnosis means to the population. And again, in a crisis situation, for them to really understand if there is a mental health problem, if they've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder or any other disorder there, what's happening is the father was saying, we gave up everything to come to the United States to give our son, our child, our only child, a son, a better life. If he had accepted that diagnosis, then what was going to happen was my son has no life. It's because the perception was it's a dead end. So understanding we're talking about a recovery model, which we will go over briefly, but it's being able to understand, because what happens is when you don't understand the situation of the community that you're working with, you can escalate a crisis because they feel like now they're being judged. And that's what's beginning to happen. So the father's becoming more and more resistant. So we're going on to the next one. We're going to just sort of pop in every once in a while, sort of little vignettes to help you understand what it looks like in a real life crisis situation. So Asian Americans, as we've talked about, they're the only racial group that is majority foreign born. So 65% of Asian Americans were born outside the United States. So everything we're talking about, again, language access becomes core to our population to a degree that you may not be seeing in other populations. And then they are of Asian descent. Basically, it's really, really important to know that the difference between a refugee and an immigrant is really important. The undocumented refugees in particular may not seek treatment because they fear documentation reporting the immigration status. So what Erin was saying, and what NPIMA believes very strongly, and this is something that Sri and I also believe in, it is not our place to be asking and playing immigration, but understanding that status in of itself can be very, very frightening for them. And oftentimes when they're looking for services, they just don't know, they just don't know where to go. And so we're also looking at, and the data is very, very hard because when they aggregate the data, they look at Asian Americans, American-born, foreign-born, and sort of glump them together. When you begin to break down the data, one study found that 70% of Southeast Asian refugees receiving mental health were diagnosed with PTSD. It's a very high population. And oftentimes, and because you've received crisis training, the importance of PTSD for our population, that becomes the norm. When they're coming here, and when 9/11 occurred, it was triggering PTSD in our communities around the country. In their heads, they knew that they were far away from the towers that were being destroyed. What it did, it triggered for them what was happening in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Laos. So as crisis workers, it may appear to be something small, but it's a great trigger, and to really understand at the level of the depth of what they are going through. And talk there for many of them is going to be a foreign problem. So talking too much about the trauma can also exacerbate the situation. So if we can sort of go on and looking at the hate crimes, this again is something that we're seeing a real trigger within the Asian American community. So 1 in 4 Asian Americans reported experiencing a hate crime or hate incidents, with Southeast Asians reporting the highest levels of hate. as a foreigner, what we're seeing with the growing anti-Asian and the anti-immigrant sentiment, you may be seeing this, that there's a sense of not trusting anybody, wondering, how am I being perceived? So how you approach them is going to be very important. There's a difference between saying that I understand this versus condoning or any behavior that may not be appropriate, but really for them to realize they are being heard and that the way that you approach them is going to be very, very important. 2 in 3 adults said they were very worried or somewhat worried about being victims of gun violence. Again, for many of them, this might be triggering if they were in a war zone. The difference between an immigrant and a refugee is that an immigrant, quote unquote, came here by choice. Just because they came here by choice, some people think, oh, their problems aren't going to be as bad as a refugee. That is not true. A refugee is understood more because they came from a war torn. They were forced out. They did not come here. But for an immigrant, the adjusting to life here can be profoundly problematic and really, really difficult for them. So despite facing frequent experiences of discrimination, it says that only 24% of NHPI adults and 16% say they needed mental health support. That's what's being said, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the accurate picture. So that's all we can sort of kind of says what's really going on with them. And there is sort of a history of racism within the Asian American communities. Again, this is not the time and the place to go into depth with that because of trying to cover so much information. But these are the kinds of things that underlying the different populations, knowing who you're talking to is going to make a profound impact on what you're going to be doing with them, for them, and how you're going to do that. I'm turn it back to Surya to talk about why racism, it really is a mental health issue and can trigger a crisis situation.
Yeah, and just sort of tying this idea of hate crimes and racism together, just coming off the heels of some of the highest hate crimes we've seen against Asian Americans during COVID, I think is, a mix of, racism plus health crimes. I think maybe people remember the stories of, COVID being called the Kung flu and many Asian Americans being publicly attacked. And so those are both hate crimes, but they have a mental health impact. It's well documented that racism has a profound impact on mental health, particularly the mental health of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Racism acts as a re-traumatization from folks who are already suffering from multiple traumas. So, when the outside world perceives you as less than or puts you and categorizes you in a box, one can begin to see themselves that way. And that creates, mental health crises and low self-esteem and, re-traumatizes any existing senses of shame that people might carry. And I think many of us know about this, about racism, but, I think sometimes people will, write it off as saying, oh, that person was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But really, it's more about that, folks are perceived as being the wrong kind of person all the time. And it doesn't really matter what situation they're in or what time it is. And that's how racism operates. And so, these communities are carrying that around with them as well, just the larger cultural narratives that are being, perpetrated. And so that's just important for us to hold in mind. I think it's important to know that 88% of hate crimes against Asian Americans also involved harassment. And that harassment also has, a mental health impact, can increase a sense of fear, panic, fear of strangers, fear possibly of someone who's coming in to do a crisis response. Are they going to harm me? That constant harassment just can make it difficult for people to feel safe, trusting of others, and sometimes even to feel like they have the strength to stand up for themselves. It's the way that, impacts us. We know also that folks who experience discrimination are more likely to experience depression. And then more likely to experience depression can sometimes lead to more likely to experience suicidal ideation, self-harm, and crisis. And that, just really wanting to hone in that this sense of discrimination can, increase the sense of a lack of trust or withdrawing from people. And so that's just really important to keep in mind. And so I think that Aaron also wanted to say a couple of things here about just how, racism ties into mobile crisis response.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think what you spoke about when folks of this community are inviting a helper in, and that helper may be somebody of a different culture, a different background, they may not know if they're helping somebody, if they're inviting somebody in who could be discriminating against them in their most vulnerable time. So I think being aware of the experience of the AANPI population, like we have to always keep that in the back of our minds when we're working with people of a different culture than who we are, because as Surya mentioned, like this has a profound impact on their mental health. It will have a profound impact on the rapport that we're attempting to establish and with our treatment outcomes. And then when we're looking at, referring these folks to outside community agencies, making sure that we're referring them to agencies who are also aware, who are able to support them in this time, who are familiar with the experience of the cultural group. And so we're not further traumatizing them by referring them to agencies that may not be appreciative of the experience that they have gone through.
Should have maybe add one more thing onto there, which is very, very relevant, particularly to the foreign-born population, but could also be the American-born population, is what may appear to be a very minor thing. It's like, I don't think anybody would say this, but the thinking might be, it's not that big of a deal. Why making such a big deal as you're watching the person escalate? It's because that constant sense of not feeling like they belong, having been harassed, that there's a lot of shame, and people oftentimes, and we've seen this over and over within the community, will not talk about being the victim of a hate crime because it brings shame on them for even having been in that situation. So again, just being aware of that what appears to be oversensitivity on their part is very, very real for them.
But yeah, just this is so important. And, I think the last thing I want to say before we move on past this slide is that one of the Asian American communities that often gets, forgotten are, Asian American Muslims. And I think that, racism has uniquely impacted folks who also identify as Muslim. Given the, national narrative around, terrorism and, threats to national security. And then people begin to, carry that, identity around and carry that fear around that they may always be perceived as a terrorist for just, again, being perceived as the wrong kind of person all the time. And, these insidious senses of racism just affect one of the strongest protective factors that we see in marginalized communities, which is a healthy cultural sense of self. And so we hope that, part of our prevention efforts always for marginalized communities can be to support a healthy cultural sense of self. But we need to really understand also that, racism has disrupted that.
Thank you. I see we have a question from Ashley or a comment.
Thank you. I was wondering, since we're on the topic of this discussion, how should we handle our documentation when the client's trigger is due to their immigration status and the changing laws that are going on? I know it was mentioned we're not supposed to document that, but if that is the actual trigger what's causing their anxiety, how do we protect our clients and be sensitive to them and their privacy, as well as making sure our documentation is accurate and we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's?
Yeah, I would recommend you could still document their experience without documenting their legal status. So just, you could say that the consumer was experiencing stress and paranoia and depression as a result of information in the media. And so you would still be able to document that without documenting their legal status.
Perfect. Thank you. So it's kind of like an art form, figure out a creative way to be settled. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And thank you.
That's right. Because I think we really have to be careful that you can't, when you're doing your SOAP notes, you can't leave critical clinical information out without giving the legal status.
Right. So, thank you for that.
So I'm going to just go into the access to care. You can read the slides there. That's the information. All policies say access to care is critical to reducing disparities in care. Our response has always been, for many of our communities, there's very little for them to access. One of the things that what we want to really sort of focus on is increasing the number of not only AANHPI providers, but any providers. And regardless what your ethnic background is, regardless whether you've got a degree or not a degree, it's providing what is culturally and linguistically responsive care. And that should be for everybody. Broadening the definition of workforce to go beyond just those with the PhDs, MDs, and MSWs. And so that's really what this is all about, is making sure that the quality of care really is culturally and linguistically responsive. So you can read the stats there. Challenges facing the lack of disaggregated data. This is really, really critical. So as you're putting information down, it really is important not to just say Asian American. The kinds of data, and there's another fact sheet that we've got we can share with you, but it's the ethnic background, the immigration status, the refugee status. And when I say immigration status, I'm not saying if they're here documented or not, but they came as an immigrant. But basic information, the stereotype of the model minority is seen as that you really don't have any problems. So it's really, really important that really some very serious problems that are there. Critical lack of culturally and linguistically responsive services. So again, going through that, what I would like to do is I think you get a sense of what some of the challenges are. And what we really want to do, because this is going to play a large part in the work that you're doing, is talking about using a strength-based approach, because we're always trying to ask the problems. We're very rarely asking what the strengths are. I'm going to turn it back to Surya, and she's going to talk about a strength-based approach, which is really, really important in working with the AANHPI communities.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So I think we've been, just talking a lot about, what might be so dire and what might be contributing to, crises in these communities. And that's really important for us to know as providers, but it's, the mental health model has always been, influenced by, looking at problems, and, we're trained to ask what's the problem, not, where are your strengths, or what are the strengths of the communities that we're working with. And so, what we can do when trying to use a strengths-based approach is to make our central focus people's strengths and not necessarily their pathology. Of course, we need to, be responsible and respond within our role and task to, whatever crisis and pathology is presenting itself. But while we're doing that, also asking folks to identify their strengths, because that can sometimes help give people the sense that they are more than just their problem. Also, it's really important that all of our interventions must be person-centered and person-driven. And what does that mean? It means that, our communities and the people that we work with help identify the problem as well as the solution. And so this is more of, a long-term approach. And so it's in the partnerships that we engage in with communities. What are the problems that you see? How do you think that we can, resolve crisis response for this community? And, that might be a different approach than we're currently taking, and possibly more effective than what we might propose, just based on what communities know about themselves and what people know about themselves. And you can also always do this in a one-on-one interaction too. What do you think is the challenge that's happening right now? And what do you think might help? We also really need to believe as providers that recovery is possible. And sometimes with our burnout and, seeing challenges, being in the face of seeing challenges day after day, we can lose that faith. And so sometimes engaging in a strengths-based approach helps us personally, move away from the deficits of our communities and populations that we work with. And then we can begin to believe again that recovery is possible if we can also remember centering the strengths of people. It's also really important to understand the role of family when working with AANHPI communities and clearly identify who might be considered family and makes decisions. Sometimes there can be, different, hierarchies and, different people who are, considered part of the central mix. And in more communal cultures and less individualistic cultures, this is really important to establishing trust and recognizing that, family engagement can sometimes be a strength. And, we could probably do a whole training on how to, engage family in an appropriate way. But it's something that's really important to recognize, family engagement, not necessarily as a deficit, but probably as something that could be seen as a strength. It's also important to integrate, peer support and, support from folks who have maybe gone through similar things from the community, and always, making room to incorporate traditional healing practices. And this is really important, particularly for migrant and refugee populations who can feel they're not competent in any area in this country, in this culture, really asking and relying on, are there any, traditional practices that might be supportive to you? Just even asking that question and letting folks know we're open to hearing about that and helping you maybe connect to what that might be. And that could look like a variety of different things. That could look like, working with traditional healers or, engaging in a particular kind of prayer or meditation. But that, it's really important for us to just remember that that's the point of all of this crisis work in the first place, is to hopefully bring people back in connection with believing that they have strengths and that they have, something to live for.
In a crisis situation, it's really, really important to not lose sight of a strength-based approach, because again, we're always focusing on what the problem is. And we've seen so often within the Asian American community, because they have been traumatized, because they've been through so much, they don't realize that they actually have some strengths. And when you ask them, I know this is really, really difficult, but what gives you strength? What has gotten you through? There's a little light that goes on. It's like, I did survive. I survived that. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do this, but I think I can survive that. And that's part of our role, is to help them get through that situation by having a shift in the capacity for them to be able to make some changes. So all the things that Sri was talking about, it becomes very, very important in a crisis situation. One of the ones that we found out, and all of us were looking at what can possibly go wrong, basically it's just you ask the wrong question to anybody, garbage in, garbage out. You ask the right question to the wrong person. You ask the right questions. I'll just sort of give you some brief examples. So it's, if you ask the wrong question to anybody, also includes failure to not ask the right question. Again, where did you find your strength versus what is the problem? It's not going to be a good question for anybody. You ask the right question to the wrong person, garbage in, garbage out. You ask the immigration history when the person is Native Hawaiian, or they've been here for 5 generations and they don't really know what the history is, sort of going back. You ask the right question to the right person, but you use the wrong methodology. And so you now know, okay, I was trained, I'm supposed to ask this, but you either do it in written form, you use the wrong language, you don't understand that maybe it's a particular dialect that's going to give you the wrong answer. I remember working with somebody who didn't understand. The girl appeared to be suicidal, all the symptoms, everything was there. But what they were doing is she took a bottle of pills, and the bottle of pills, because they didn't understand that in her native language or native country, you take the pochai pills, a bottle of pills. She was not intending to kill herself. You can go through each of these ways where, by not understanding what's happening, can give you the false sense of where they're going with that. So you want to make sure that you're using the right language, the right dialect, and you've got the proper interpreter. Ask the right question to the right person, but you don't understand the response. Ask the hearing voices, they say yes. You think they're psychotic, there's auditory hallucinations. It might be because they have a belief in spirits. How you assess what you're hearing and interpreting it can have a profound impact on what you do next. You ask the right question to the right person. You understand the response, but you implement inappropriate intervention strategies. You provide medication instead of using a traditional healer. And I think you can go through any one of these, but this gives you sort of a nice, quick, dirty, just what is the question I'm asking? What am I hearing? What does it really, really mean? And that's what we can always go back to asking them, and I think, Erin, you had some notes, so you want to add something about for mobile crisis responders?
Yeah, and I think, with all of us being mental health professionals and being, it's utilizing our soft skills, and it's reading the body language, reading the facial expression. So when we say something or we ask something and someone gives like a facial expression, I'm like, so it's asking, it's following up. It's maybe asking your question in a different way. When you perceive that someone is uncomfortable, it's checking in on that. So with the number of dialects that Dr. Ida talked about, with the number of different cultures that we have, it's impossible for anyone to be an expert in everything. So if you're seeing that someone shifted, that their energy moved, ask. And so it may be us restating the question differently. It may be us showing our cultural humility by saying, hey, I'm not sure what just happened here. It seems I may have disrespected you. That was not my intent. And it's being open, being transparent about what information we're trying to get. And so it's just using all of our soft skills and kind of, like tuning into body language, to facial expressions, and being humble and making sure that we ask differently.
I want to sort of add on to that point about ask for clarification. Oftentimes as providers, it's feel like I'm supposed to know everything. They're not going to trust me if I ask questions. When you ask somebody else, I'm not sure. What does this mean? Does it have specific meanings either in your culture, language, what we would have done? What you're actually doing is you're giving them an opportunity to show that they do have competence, they do have some control. And that's a real important thing, again, going back to their entire existence is one of feeling like they aren't competent. People are saying because you speak with an accent, you're not as smart as. All these different ways that we may not be aware, but we know that they are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So again, those are just some of the things that you can do when you're working with them. And as we're sort of wrapping up, we're crammed a lot into this hour. Suri's going to just take us to the key learning and takeaways.
Great. Thank you, DJ and Erin. So just as a summary before we move into some Q&A and closing for this last half hour here, just to summarize the key learnings and takeaways from today. One, the behavioral health field is moving towards cultural humility model more and more that aligns with California's transformed approach to mobile crisis, which is more of a community-based response and less of a reliance on law enforcement. And it includes peers and community health workers, and you all are a part of that. The AANHPI population in California is very diverse ethnically, culturally, and linguistically. Immigrants from our communities have high rates of mental health challenges, including trauma and PTSD, which are compounded by experiencing racism, xenophobia, and discrimination and harassment. There is a significant dearth in mental health services that meet the cultural and language needs of our populations, according to NPIMA. Crisis interventions are more effective when mobile crisis teams understand the AANHPI specific beliefs about the origins of mental health crises and appropriate treatment modalities. So again, this is asking, how do you understand what might be happening right now? And how can you help me understand how you see what's going on and what might be the solution? And finally, mobile crisis teams should understand the importance of using properly trained behavioral health interpreters to ensure that team members know how to access those appropriate interpreters. And I've seen some comments in the chat and links posted in the chat of how to get access to those services, and have built-in competencies such as going through this training and how to effectively work with interpreters. And there are also more specified trainings for that as well.
And one more thing for our crisis responders out there in the world, I would recommend, because although we triage all of our calls, and we usually will have information if somebody speaks a different language, and then we're able to prepare the language line ahead of time, have those language line numbers on you, because you never know who you may be engaging with out in the field. And from experience, sometimes it takes 20, 30 minutes to get a qualified, appropriate interpreter on the phone. So if you know when you're heading out to the field that you're going to need to access a language line qualified interpreter, get that going ahead of time. Because we want to make sure that we're providing excellent customer service and appropriate cultural care, getting the right person on the phone who will be able to support us. So getting those language lines ahead of time and having access to those numbers while you're out in the field, if you are not aware that somebody would be more comfortable speaking in a different language.
And I think sort of adding on to that, we had to sort of pull out some things that we just didn't have time to cover. But when you talk about language, always ask them, what is their preferred language? Somebody may sound like they are fairly fluent, but when you're coming into a crisis situation, you're dealing with very complex emotional issues. They're oftentimes going to be a lot more comfortable in their primary language, even though they may sound like they are fluent in English. So really understand that. Just don't assume it's, well, we can't get an interpreter for you. You speak English just fine. We really need to make sure that they're getting the appropriate care. The other thing is, I've seen situations where they asked for somebody who was from, and we had somebody who said that they were from Thailand. They got a Thai interpreter. The person was in a serious crisis. They were not from Thailand. They were in a camp in Thailand. They're from Cambodia. They had the absolute wrong language. So you always ask them, what is their preferred language, their primary language, not where they are from. So just little things like that. So as you're prepping to make sure that they get in line with somebody who's going to really help them, are just very, very important to ask information. So these are just, are there any other more questions? Because if not, I'm going to sort of move on.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Danielle from the TA Center. I just had a question, I think, or maybe a wondering. I'm sure many of the mobile crisis providers here in the room might have the same question or wondering. I've come across, and I've seen, I've heard also, sometimes you come across someone who English is not their first language. And when you ask them what their preferred language is, they insist on English because they see it as an opportunity to practice, or also, fear of being looked down on or stigmatized. And so I'm wondering if you have any recommendations or best practices on how to approach that. I've been in the field where they have insisted to use English, but I can feel and I can see that there's a disconnect, that there's not this full grasp or understanding of what's happening or what needs to happen. And I think that can sometimes lead to potential harm, right?
Thank you very much for raising it, because that does happen quite frequently for all the reasons that you cited. You never want to do a challenge, but it's to respect that and to say, this is great, and it's really nice. So what you do is you sort of normalize, this is great. But sometimes, when we're in a really difficult situation, it's harder to, it's not unusual for somebody to say, in the moment, I actually more comfortable in reverting back to that language. So you give them the option that they know that you're aware of the differences there, but you're not going to say, no, I know you're not going to, and I know you wouldn't say it this way, but that you're not going to be challenged. So you move on. But if you're not sure, you can always say, I wasn't sure if I was saying it clearly. So we always own the problem instead of saying, I'm not sure if you understood. I'm not sure if I explained it clearly. Can you maybe say back to me what you thought that I said? Because then you can tell, maybe we can sort of shift. Either I can try to say it differently, or again, this is when maybe people who are fluent in English, but they find that using their primary language actually helps them express themselves better. So that's the way that what you do is you let them know that their communication can be a very tricky situation. And even if you're speaking only one language, so it sort of normalizes, and then you give them the option to then to switch languages as one way of getting through that particular impasse. So that usually works.
Thank you so much.
But I really appreciate it because that's unusual. I had people who would just say, but my kid always interprets for me. And well, it was again, we got rid of the slides on language. Never, ever, we're not going to have time on this, but when we work with the community, when we work with interpreters, never use a child. We don't have time. Maybe on February 5th, we'll go into detail on that one, but I see Erin shaking her head. It's like, no. And we've seen this over and over. Please, please, please. It just, so to be continued on that particular comment, we will go to more depth next round.
Yes, excellent. Next week we're going to, and we'll talk about this in a few moments, but we're going to have a community of practice continuing discussion next week, and specifically we'll be talking about some of these, language considerations and working with interpreters. So we'll have a lot more time to dive into that then too. Okay, DJ, do you want to just talk a little bit about NAPIMA's trainings and resources for learning before we open it up for more questions and then closing?
Right. So basically, again, you can read this and you'll have access to these slides, but it's just to let you know that NAPIMA has been around for a while. And one of the things the reason why NAPIMA was established was to really improve the quality of services for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. So the broad categories is culturally informed mental health trainings, and you can see the listings there: achieving whole health, mental health first aid, growing our own mental health interpreters, mental learning collaboratives, community-based mental health programs, Friends to Make a Difference for youth, community-driven policy and advocacy, community crisis supports. A couple that I would like to highlight on that is we've always supported people with lived experience. And when we're talking about that, oftentimes, and particularly for those with degrees, as the experts, we have the answers and we'll help others and we'll teach them how to do it. NAPIMA is very, very pleased with the fact that we have NAPIAN, the National Asian American Pacific Islander Empowerment Network. I want to highlight that one in particular because I would love for any of you who have individuals within your communities to want to get involved in that and learn about how we provide really the voice of those with lived experience, which should be driving everything that we do. And so this is a very, very brief overview of what NAPIMA does in terms of just some of the activities. And on the policy level, we've been there for years behind the scenes, working on a lot of policies, and would love to continue to work with all of you in ways that we can add other voices. And you can help us understand what are the strengths, what are the things you do in California, and what can we, as in partnership, work with you to say what are the other things that we can sort of work on. One last thing, just to toot our own horns. We were able to get May 10th designated as the National Asian American Mental Health Day. We went to members of Congress, and this is the first time it happened. So when you see Mental Health Days May 10th, that was something that we take great pride in. We're trying to get that established in every single state. So that's, in a nutshell, who we are and what we've done. So, and that's why it's hard for me to sort of retire, because we've been involved in all these things. But we've got an amazing team that's carrying things on, and would love for you to join us in those efforts. We cannot do this alone. And all of you are playing a really key role in being in the community. So that's NAPIMA. And there's the next slide, the resource of continuous learning. And these are things like the California Reducing Disparities Project. So Rocco Chang put together an incredible report, and that was then looking at prevention programs and gives you some really good resources within the state of California. We also have on our website a listing of all we try to update this as much as possible, but these are community behavioral health organizations that focus specifically on AANHPIs, and that list continues to grow. There is the Ohana Project, which is based in Hawaii. They were able to get a Center of Excellence program from SAMHSA. They're physically located in Hawaii, but they're working with CBOs around the country. So if you want information, we'd be glad to provide that stuff to you also. That these are just some of the resources. I know that Aaron and CARS, they have some resources within the state of California that will also be really helpful for you.
Yeah, we just want to open it up to the rest of the group right now. If you have any questions or comments for our experts today, so if anyone has any additional questions, by all means, jump in.
I just want to say my name is Raven. I'm from Lake County Behavioral Health. And I just want to say thank you. That was I've been wanting to hear for a long time response to the crisis that happened to our Asian American brothers and sisters, like during COVID-19. That was so heartbreaking to see, and to like not know that we had a response for it was really heartbreaking. And so like I'm glad that we're able to have this safe space to come together and know that DHCS is on our team, and for all its minorities and stuff. And we're starting a tribal outreach program here in my county, and so like we're running into a lot of the same stuff. Having like we deal with a lot of racism over here. All our management and leadership workforces are Caucasian only most of the time. And so I'm very lucky to have a job with the county. I'm like the only Native American here with the county. And so I have good bosses, 2 good bosses, and it seems like they're trying to make some difference. So yeah, this is my first meeting here with you guys, and I hope to come back next meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, I think sharing what each of our communities have historically gone through, how we're moving through this next phase, and what we can teach each other, learn from each other. I've always thought work with the community has been a real gift. It's not what hopefully we can share with others, but what we in turn get to learn. And I think as we're opening this up, just being able to share this information would be an absolute joy for all of us.
So I just wanted to also share, we're going to be doing the community of practice on February 5th. And so if there's any particular questions or even, case studies or, challenges or, whatever it might be that folks are encountering in your work, if there's anything you want to kind of give us a heads up about that we can make sure to incorporate, feel free to come off mute and share or put it in the chat. That would be really great.
And also, I just want to plug some of the other events that we have going on. So we have the remainder of this series, which includes discussing the Black African American experience, discussing LGBTQ, the Latinx experience, and as well reviewing youth. So those are the other cultural competency humility trainings that are coming up in the next few months. We also have our Tribal County Partners COP series. So those are on a monthly basis where we have our subject matter experts from Kaufman and Associates who we have partnered with. And we have our first episode psychosis training series coming up as well. I encourage you guys to sign on to the newsletter so you can get information on all of these trainings. And that will include the COP for next week as well. That will allow you guys to register for that event. The COP next week will be a little bit less formal, more discussion, more question, more opportunity to, just ask questions, have any wonderings, have any dialogue about, things that you maybe didn't think of to ask during this session. But as you're between this and next session, start thinking about, what are different ways that we can help the Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander population. So we kind of give you this space to continue that thought process. And as Gina, go ahead.
I was just curious about, sometimes we go out on calls like for families and it's like the kiddo, like the teenager is wanting, like the support with wanting like therapy and, wanting to get that. And you've got the parents that are definitely like, more old school tradition and within, and trying to kind of navigate through both, both sides of it when like I'm a family advocate. So like because I'm working with the parents and the families and trying to kind of support them as a whole, even though there's the difference in how they're seeing it. And just kind of curious as to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can probably both speak to this. I think it's a very common challenge. And, I think we probably both have different things to say on it. I think the thing I want to emphasize is the importance of trying to connect parents to possibly like other parents who may be going through the same thing. And how do you find those parents? Sometimes there's, different support groups. For example, I'm familiar with one. It's more specific, but it's with PFLAG. That's for, LGBTQ folks, but there's an Asian American specific PFLAG for parents. And I've seen that be extremely supportive in helping parents meet other Asian American parents who might have kids going through similar things, and then recognizing, oh, therapy is something that, people in our community access. So I think just getting parents connected to other parents with similarities can be one helpful thing.
Yeah, I think what Sri is talking about is really, really important. And it can be really nice when they're not alone. So I would like to add a couple of things on that. One is in the moment. And then the other is prepping so that if in the moment you've got something to refer to. So in the moment, again, it's just saying what you want to do is like, I know it's really, really hard, particularly if you're coming to a new country, it can feel really, really different. It's not unusual for there to be some real challenges there, because oftentimes when the child is having a problem, the parent feels like they have somehow failed and they're already feeling like they're in a one-down position. Their 5-year-old kid speaks English better than they do. They don't know how to get to the grocery stores, these very everyday kinds of things, which always makes them feel in a one-down position. Maybe on the 5th, we can go through some of the things that when you're doing outreach work with them, but it's normalizing it. And then just, again, providing their support. And one of the things that's really, really helpful is because there's that sense of, I have somehow failed. It's like, we know that it's acknowledging to them that more than anybody, you want what's in the best interest of your child. And that can be really, really hard sometimes. Sometimes you need a little bit of extra help, particularly if you're in a new country. And that's what we're here for is to help you find the best ways for you to help your child. And what I've seen far too often is people step in and they become sort of the expert and the parents get pushed aside. And it's not intended to be a power play, but we just automatically do that. We always keep the parent in that primary position, but they can't do it alone. But it's like, we know this is what you want. You are the mother, you are the father. And I used to have like 4 or 5 different tapes going on in my head. Sometimes you do that anymore. I don't want to call social services, but you keep that up. They call me becoming. But you always do that because what you're doing is you're honoring and helping them not feel like they're always in that one down. I'm not even as smart as my 5. So those are things. The other thing, and there were some great things out in Philadelphia and other places. What they did is they actually put together programs that were not identified as mental health. But what they were doing is they were doing things just to bring together the communities and the generations. It was a mental health intervention strategy, but with the Cambodian community, all the kids knew about Cambodia was my parents came from a war and Pol Pot. Their cultural identity was that of trauma. And what they did is they put together a little cookbook. And the parents, the mothers, and the grandmothers were then teaching the younger kids about different recipes, things that they could do. And in the process, they were beginning to learn, oh, there's a lot more to this than just trauma. And so when something did come up, Uri had formed a group where they were working together. So it's sort of a long-term, but it goes back to things of redefining mental health. You want to avoid, if there's a time for diagnosis, but sometimes we have to put it down because that's going to get you reimbursed. But if we can change what we do and we see everything we do as mental health, bringing culture and doing dance, whatever it happens to be, you're creating a healthy community that allows them to then hopefully minimize the number of crises. But in the case of a crisis, you've already formed that kind of a relationship. So that's, again, going to the CLAS standards, looking at, we make changes at all levels. And that's one that just creates healthy, really healthy communities. So again, it'll be really fun to hear what all of you are doing. We've got 5 minutes left. Let's spend time there. But I love the questions that all of you are asking, because it's again goes, what would we do? Or what have we done? Or what have we learned? So again, great questions. Really, really good.
And one of the benefits of the mobile crisis benefit that we're billing towards is that we don't need a diagnosis. So we can really focus on the person and focus, be person-centered, and just focus on the person and what they need. So it's a huge benefit for us that we don't have to focus on the stigma or on, are they meeting all of the criteria for major depressive? Doesn't matter. We are here, we're helping. And I want to give a huge, enormous thank you to Dr. DJ Ida and Dr. Soraya Bhattacharya. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and expertise.
What I would like to do is just that one slide, and it's a special thank you slide. And absolutely. I always like to sort of close on this one because it is a cultural thank you. And on that one, it says Okage-sama de. So this is the characters for Okage-sama de. And it's used in Japanese to say thank you, but it's much, much more than thank you. It's to be thankful with gratitude. Kage is the Japanese word for shadow. So it's literally to be in the shadow of others, to be grateful for those who have gone before, those who have survived trauma, those who have learned about the communities, whatever it happens to be. We like to close with this because we're always changing, we're always different. By you taking this and learning and building on your experiences, you're going to change people's lives. They may never know who you are. They've never heard your name, but they will be in your shadow. So thank you is to say thank you for those things that go unseen, go unheard. They may never know you, but you're going to change somebody else's life who down the road, and the person that their lives are changing, they're going to owe you Okage-sama de. So as we're closing out, we always like to sort of finish with this slide. So as we say to you, our thank you is to you. So to all of you, Okage-sama de, for being here and for being part of this journey that we're all on. And it's been a joy for us.